Hello everyone and welcome to another video. I've been debating to make this video over the last 2 years as I learned more about this topic. If you're anything like me, you might be baffled by our collective inaction in the face of systemic threats like climate change or the pandemic. The reasons behind these behaviors are complicated, but I can help explain them, and that's what I'm going to try to do in this video. This will be an extremely long and complex topic because each of the parts of the video require nuance and time to explain, and more importantly, I should warn that there are very negative topics ahead. So if you're someone that's sensitive about these things, you should be careful and maybe skip the video altogether. However, for those of us that wants to communicate these things, I think it's important for people to listen in. It's natural to become upset when we hear about these things. A lot of people initially they have fears. They fear they will actually become hopeless at all. But actually, once you go through that initial phase, and I will go into more detail about that later in this video, how there is all sort of a cycle that you go through. Once you go through that, people feel empowered actually, and they are more aware, and that helps us collectively that we can do something to soften the effects of what I'm about to describe in the video. I will try to end on a kind of a positive note, but still the information in this video is upsetting and depressing, and people must take time to grieve and process the information that will be presented. Now, even though I will be making this presentation and I will be presenting data and news clippings and my own opinion, of course, I may be wrong. It's natural to be wrong. I've been wrong in things before. But even though I could be wrong, I am far from alone in the rough conclusions of this video. And more scientists are getting more vocal about this topic. I should also add that overall strict empiricism is incomplete in assessing what I'm about to talk about, the predicament. And by definition, high-quality peer-review academic data will only be available once it's too late to mitigate and adapt to the situation I'm about to describe. So, mathematically proving our predicament that it's coming or that is maybe already unfolding might not be possible. So data must be combined with intuition and reasoning. So if you're just waiting to see raw data, I cannot present that. I can only present a framework that I've compiled and that I will be presenting together. And in that regard, the video I've structured in these initial sections, let's say, the ape, the market, the fossils, the network, the anomaly, the particle, and the predicament. So these will be each sections that we will cover in very extensively, I should say, and you will be able to skip to parts if you want to go to a specific one by choosing from the timeline below. But yeah, let's begin. So up until 2020, I was operating in a personal framework of regarding the future, at least, that the future is either going to be good or it's going to be bad. Mostly that it's not going to continue the way it is. So things are either going to increase and get better and better over time, you know, traveling the stars and flying cars and no poverty and all the issues are going to be fixed somehow, especially with technology, or things that are kind of bad are gonna keep getting bad and eventually it's gonna cause some sort of major issue. So this image in a way describes all the possibilities that exist where we are now, and depending on what happens, we can still recover depending on what happens, depending on that catastrophe. But in some senses, it's very hard to recover from that. So through compiling all the information that I will present in this video, I've come to believe that we're actually in the path of maybe not extinction necessarily, as it says here, but at least a collapse. And collapse is a difficult word because there's a lot of assumptions behind that word when people hear it. I will try to describe it better further ahead. But you should not be afraid of the word itself. Many things collapse all the time, after all, including civilizations. Another vision of what I'm describing here is this more recent graph made by Tony Seba under Rethink X. So here they are also kind of identifying that there are factors that driving breakthrough, that drive technology and our ability to solve problems, but there are also factors that are preventing us from doing that. Although they are still very optimistic, as I've said before, I think we're actually in worse shape than we think, and we are headed towards what is called here as collapse. As we will go through the contents of this video, you might feel yourself going through some of these steps in what's called the ladder of awareness. This is nothing really complicated or complex. I will be describing these steps now so you can understand what's going on. So the first step, that's the first, let's say, step of ignorance. It's when you think there are no fundamental problems with the world, just some small shortcomings in human organization or behavior or morality that can be fixed if we really just had, proper initiative and attention, and we were taking more care of how we make the rules. So people that are in this stage tend to live their lives very happy. They are just slightly annoyed sometimes, especially around election times or when the earnings from corporations come out. The second step on this ladder of awareness is when you are aware of one fundamental problem. And this can be something like climate change, overpopulation, peak oil, chemical pollution, overfishing, biodiversity loss, corporatism, economic instability, or injustice. So that problem might engage your attention completely. And you actually might even become a very strong activist because you're so passionate about that cause. So you'll become very vocal about that issue, but you might be blind to other issues. In the next step of this ladder, you might start to become aware of many problems. As you let in more evidence from different domains, the awareness of the overall complexity begins to grow. And that at that point, you might start to worry if you're really prioritizing the problems correctly, because some might be more immediate and some might be more impactful. So some people actually at this stage might become reluctant to acknowledge new problems. For example, someone who is committed to fighting for social justice and against climate change may not recognize the problem of resource depletion. They might feel that their problem space, so to speak, is already complex enough, and that the addition of any new concerns will only dilute the effort that needs to be focused on solving the highest priority problem. Then, on the next step of this ladder of awareness, you begin to have an awareness of the interconnections between the many problems, and that the realization that a solution in one domain may worsen a problem in another marks this beginning of large-scale system-level thinking. It also will mark the transition from thinking of the situation in terms of a set of problems to thinking of it in terms of a predicament. And at this point, the possibility that there may not be a solution begins to raise its head. People who arrive at this stage tend to withdraw into tight circles of like-minded individuals in order to trade insights and deepen their understanding of what's going on. These circles are necessarily small, both because personal dialogue is essential for this depth of exploration, and because there just aren't very many people who have arrived at this level of understanding. And finally, the last step of this ladder of awareness is that you have an awareness that the predicament encompasses all aspects of life. This includes everything we do, how we do it, our relationships with each other, as well as our treatment of the rest of the biosphere and the physical planet. With this realization, the floodgates open, and no problem is exempt from consideration or acceptance. The very concept of a solution is seen through and cast aside as a waste of effort. So, now we will dive deep into the topics, and keep in mind these different levels, and then towards the end of the video you might look back on this slide and try to think where would you situate yourself in now that you've learned about all the things that I will be talking about. So the first big topic that I would like to to talk about is the ape. Here I'm referring, of course, to Homo sapiens, us, the species. And I have here a picture of showing our evolution, and this is also to mention how, even though we have very humbly called ourselves the wise hominid, I would actually maybe describe us better as Homo relator or Homo faber, which means the storytelling monkey, let's say, or the storytelling tool maker. So we are, I think, creator of tools and stories, and we have been shaped by evolution to be able to perform rational and complex thought, to be able to solve problems, to be able to overcome adverse environments, to survive. But the way we have evolved and the way our brain works now, I would argue, is subject to shortcuts and tendencies that work a bit against us. So one of these shortcuts that affects us, most of the times we're not aware of these, are called biases, cognitive biases, or logical fallacies. Here I'm linking to two pop science websites where you can find more about these in a more engaging way, with some examples of a bias and a fallacy. If you are more interested in these things, you can also check the Wikipedia page that lists them a bit more extensively. But basically, these are kind of shortcuts, things that we fool ourselves into thinking we are believing things in a good way, or in a way that is realistic, or that matches reality, but in fact we are kind of self-diluting ourselves in a very exotic way that we are not aware, because it feels smooth when you are thinking in a fallacy, or when you have a cognitive bias. It's so intertwined with our own brain that we are not aware that these are happening. So I'm going to give you a few examples of these, and how they affect us, and how they will affect all of the topics that I will talk about in the future. And the first of the really big one, I should say, that I dedicate a lot of time, is over-optimism. And I've compiled a few articles and papers here that I will link in the description. And I will also read parts of these so you can get an idea of what I'm talking about. So here they talk about how an important message from our work and that of others is that expecting good things to happen is not enough. Optimism is beneficial when it translates into action in pursuit of goals. You can expect good things, but you have to be willing to put in the effort to make the good things happen. This combination of optimism and action helps work up the motivation to achieve goals, and also helps you persist when you encounter challenges or obstacles. It's also important to note that having positive expectations is not the same as fantasizing. A program of research by the psychologist Gabrielle Oettingen and her colleagues has shown that visually imagining the success is not helpful. Creating fantasies can lull you into overconfidence and complacency, leading you to perform worse and lowering your motivation. But instead of elaborate positive fantasies, our findings suggest that a belief that success is possible is what helps us succeed, so long as there is scope for effort to influence outcomes. If there is nothing you can do about a future event, optimism will not affect the outcome. However, even in such scenarios, being optimistic could lower your stress levels. So here I would bring a bit of my own opinion into this. Here, I think this highlights a bit the intersection between hopium and being a doomer. If you're not aware of that, being a doomer is kind of like a pop culture reference nowadays, where people get stuck in a cycle of bad news, and they just abuse their own attention span with these bad news, and they fall into very depressive states, let's say. And on the opposite side, you have what is called hopium, which is a mix of hope and opium. It's seeing hope as almost like a very enticing drug that you get easily addicted to, and it might make you ignore the bad things. So in this sense, doomers, they have no hope at all. They don't believe any form of success is possible at all. They will say, what's the point? We're all screwed. And hopium, on the other hand, leads to having elaborate positive fantasies completely untethered from reality. And I would argue both approaches are detrimental, while a measured, realistic approach with a serving of optimism seems to be the best. And to justify this a little bit more, I share some of these findings that I've had. Here you have a paper. Optimistic expectations have benefits for effort and emotion with little cost. And one of the key takeaways is these results are consistent with the EMT-derived hypothesis that optimistic expectations have benefits for effort and emotion before an event occurs, with little cost after the outcome occurs. In this one of my key takeaways was we propose that positive or negative affective reactions to future events innervate motivations to approach or avoid the events. These motivations can be satisfied by judging that events that elicit positive affective reactions are likely to occur and events that elicit negative affective reactions are unlikely to occur. The tendency to be optimistic thus results from emotional processes that occur largely outside of conscious awareness. We discuss recent evidence that supports these propositions, the import of understanding optimism as the result of emotional processes for judgment and decision research, as well as attempts to improve decision making and remaining unresolved issues. Here they mention the ability to anticipate is a hallmark of cognition. Inferences about what will occur in the future are critical to decision making, enabling us to prepare our actions so as to avoid harm and gain reward. Given the importance of these future projections, one might expect the brain to possess accurate, unbiased foresight. Humans, however, exhibit a pervasive and surprising bias. When it comes to predicting what will happen to us tomorrow, next week, or 50 years from now, we overestimate the likelihood of positive events and underestimate the likelihood of negative events. For example, we underrate our chances of getting divorced, being in a car accident, or suffering from cancer. We also expect to live longer than objective measures would warrant, overestimate our success in the job market, and believe that our children will be especially talented. This phenomenon is known as the optimism bias, and it is one of the most consistent, prevalent, and robust biases documented in psychology and behavioral economics. So you can see here, I'm trying to really build the case that we tend to view the future in rose-colored glasses, and that will be important that you keep in mind as we discuss the future topics ahead. Here I found another interesting article mentioning toxic positivity. Here they bring up how refusing to look at life's darkness and avoiding uncomfortable experiences can be detrimental to mental health. This toxic positivity, as it is called, is ultimately a denial of reality. Telling someone to stay positive in the middle of a global crisis is missing out on an opportunity for growth, not to mention likely to backfire and only make them feel worse. Here, another takeaway is these findings indicate that optimism is tied to selective update failure and diminished neural coding of undesirable information regarding the future. So our brain is kind of trying to select the information to feed itself in a way to maintain this narrative that we are already predisposed to, which is to think that the future is naturally going to be better. Okay, so that was one big subtopic, which was over optimism. Here we go a bit more into another one called experiential avoidance. And I apologize in advance if this is a lot of me reading or text, but it's important that you understand the nuances and the complexities of these things. So here they say, part of being human means experiencing pain and discomfort. At some point in their lives, most people will experience uncertainty of whether one's ideas are worthy of being shared, anxiety prior to disagreeing with someone else, bouts of loneliness, and the heartbreak of a relationship ending. Negative emotional experiences range from mundane to profound, weak to intensely disturbing. Anger can help to confront goal-related obstacles. Envy can motivate to improve one's knowledge and skills. Guilt and embarrassment can help to become caring and cooperative. Making progress on important goals often requires working through setbacks, adversity, and discomfort. And in this paper, this chapter explores one response style that is particularly problematic: experiential avoidance. So here they review research on the role of experiential avoidance in anxiety disorders, and they have overall an overview of how experiential avoidance functions as a nearly universal vulnerability in the development and maintenance of anxiety disorders. So here you can kind of see how we might tend to avoid thinking about things because of the discomfort that they bring, even though we could benefit ultimately from experiencing that discomfort because we can rise to the occasion, we can improve ourselves. All right, so those were maybe more of the most abstracted concepts I wanted to talk about on the subtopics of our own brain and how it works. Now I'm going to talk about some more maybe easier to understand things, which is, or maybe they're not easy. They're easy for me at least. But a very important one is hyperbolic discounting. And this refers to the tendency for people to increasingly choose a smaller, sooner reward over a larger, later reward, as the delay occurs sooner rather than later in time. So one practical example of this would be how people actually end up getting lung cancer or diabetes when it would seem simpler, more rational, and beneficial to give up smoking and sugar at the present to avoid that higher future cost. It seems we have evolved this hyperbolic discounting concept through natural selection, and that concept has favored us in individual and tribe survival. But I believe it's unfit for collective global survival. And as we talk about future topics here in this video, you will see how this keeps coming up all the time. One more, this will be maybe the more exotic one, is how we are kind of blind to something called hyperobjects. And hyperobjects are objects that are so beyond our everyday reality. They are so, they have many properties that are kind of permeating all around us in a sense that it's hard to really identify them. We can only identify them through science and through very careful, rigorous observation, but we don't really feel them as real because they are not really real in the sense that a normal object is. So some of their properties are that it's viscous, so they kind of adhere to other objects. And I can give you already some examples of hyperobjects. They can be things like styrofoam or things like climate change. So you can see already that the categories can vary very wildly. And many things are actually hyperobjects that you might not be aware of. But yeah, they have certain properties, and they are difficult for us to really grasp at a fundamental level compared to how we can grasp a glass of water, for example, because they are so different than what our senses tell us every day. All right, and here's some more paradoxes that are very important to know. One of these is the preparedness paradox. This proposes that if a society or an individual acts effectively to mitigate a potential disaster, such as a pandemic, a natural disaster, or other catastrophe, so that it causes less harm, the avoided danger will be perceived as having much less serious because of the limited damage actually caused. So an example of this would be how there is money being spent, for example, on preventing a pandemic to happen, and then because the pandemics don't happen, because we have this paradox working in our minds, the people in charge of the funding might cut away the funding, thinking, oh, we don't have to spend so much money because we're not experiencing bad things coming from this pandemic. And then a pandemic might happen, and we are less prepared for it because this preparedness paradox kind of prevented us from really observing that we were actually doing good things, and then we took that away. Another little paradox you could say is something called escalation of commitment. It's how even though we might be facing increasingly negative outcomes from a decision, action, or investment, we might continue that behavior instead of altering course. You might have heard of this concept by another name. It's also known as the sunk cost fallacy. So one example would be how in a road that might be very congested, it might be obvious to just increase the number of lanes to allow more cars to pass through and have less congestion. But in in reality, what happens is there is more congestion as the cars come to fill up that space. And the better thing to do would have been to start building, for example, efficient rail transportation solutions. So this is just one example, but again, I'm presenting things here and I will link to them so you can feel free to check the description and read more about them to hear more examples about them. Yeah, I think this one was the one that surprised me the most, because I was not aware of it so much when I first encountered it, which is something that happens very normally, that we just tend to disbelieve or minimize the threat warnings that come to us. So you might remember during the beginning of the pandemic, it was, at least for me, it was very clear very early on that this was going to be a problem. And when I brought it up to people around me, they just completely minimized that they would not even reach the country where I was in, or it was not going to be a big deal at all, or that nothing would need to be done because it would kind of fade away. And yeah, the really interesting part here is how in about 70% of all people, there's this sort of normalcy bias that is displayed during a disaster. So that's kind of concerning, how we have this this issue that really prevents us from taking action when it's important to take action, especially in something that very early on. So our predisposition to assume that the way things have been are the way things will always will be, and to resist accepting future change, since it conflicts with our memories of past experiences. So some people would call this change reticence due to the interplay between communication, avoidance, and the reserved, restrained rate of change, implementation, integration. It's not really a straight up change denial, for the most part at least. It's more like dragging our feet, leaving things in opaque assumptions, lacking communication, and avoiding either discussing it or integrating it. As a caveat, I will say that I believe that we humans are actually quite adaptable, but we cling to our previous mental models until the last moment possible, since often these mental models are base beliefs. So they are beliefs that form the base on which you have many more beliefs supported. So to change that base belief will cost you a lot of mental energy and processing. So we tend to not want to do that. And paradoxically, even though we are quite adaptable, sometimes that can also kind of play against us. And one of the ways that it plays against us is through something called the shifting baseline syndrome, where some drastic changes occurring, but it's still occurring rather slowly, and we just come to accept the new state as the new baseline, the new normal, and we become used to it. And then another change occurs and we become used to that. So here you can see how marine life has been consistently deteriorating through the decades. And we just come to accept that now the sea is not as plentiful as it is, and we just kind of live with that. It becomes part of our everyday reality. Another very interesting example about this is forests. Here you can see on the left how, specifically in the US, there was all this huge area of virgin forest, and today that has been reduced dramatically. But you might still think, oh, but we have a lot of forests still in the US. I don't know what you're talking about. Well, these are different forests. Nowadays, when we think of forests, we're actually thinking more closely resembles tree farms rather than an actual virgin forest, or as it's described here, an old growth forest. So these are very different things, but we have changed our baseline to come to accept new things. So yeah, that was the end of the first topic, how all these biases and cognitive biases and fallacies and paradoxes that we have in our brain, all of these things, they're always there. We cannot ever shut them down. We can be aware of them and try to compensate for them, but they will always be there. So we have to be alert. And all of these, in many ways, are going to play a key role in the following topics that I'm going to talk about now. So, The next big topic I would talk about is the market. And here I'm describing the market as a useful term for both capitalism, the development of investment to fund exploration and extraction, limited liability, specialization, trade, and economic growth as a target. So these are kind of all the different things I'm going to be touching upon. And one of the first things that happen as humans develop markets, specifically more of the modern notion of markets, is something that I would call the ransacking of the commons. So back in the Middle Ages, even though there was feudal lords and kings and things like that, a lot of people survived because there was a common land that they had access to, and they could make a living out of that. However, as several things happened in our development in history, there began a process of enclosure, somehow of privatization of that previously common land, and that limited people's abilities to become self-sufficient. Suddenly, you either needed to work for someone else to afford land to even to live, or you had to find the wealth yourself to purchase that land. And that's the state where we are now. We no longer have these commons as we used to do. We rely on this market to be able to survive. So that's an important context for you to keep in mind, and that is affecting us every day. And another thing that is important to know about the market has been this trend of specialization. We humans, we didn't used to be this specialized. It's more of a modern phenomena that we have become, each in our own industry, in our own field of expertise, we have become masters of that because of the competitive nature of how the market has evolved. So specialization has been a key component of markets. There is an incentive to specialize and to reach the physical limit of a trade or industry in order to gain that competitive advantage. And specialization begets specialization. As other tasks start to be delegated to other parts of society, this all pushes automation and increases productivity. When you become also specialized in an activity, this might limit your natural intellectual range. So you become very good at one thing, but not good at other things that you would otherwise have to become. And this also means that decision making is delegated to specialists in the fields, and they might tend to have a narrower focus on potential consequences in other fields of their own, or even second order consequences in their own fields. And as a very common example of specialization, here I'm showing how the number of farms have decreased and the number of farmers have decreased massively throughout at least this last century, and still we have been able to produce a lot of food, and the average farm size has also increased because there has been that specialization where few farmers can grow more food. So in a way, the point I'm trying to make is, yes, there has been gains from this, but it's not all rosy with specialization. There are trade-offs, let's say. And of course, one of the big issues with the market, as I see it, is this growth dogma, where once you unlock the initial benefits of growth, longer lifespans, being able to support higher populations, better technological problem solving, once you start to unlock that, societies tend to become locked to that growth as the sole target. And in our case, we also start to require an ever-increasing amount of resources and energy to be able to support that growth. And once you become locked in that growth, here locked, I mean, it kind of becomes like a cultural perception that growth is inherently a good thing, and it's also becomes like a philosophy of companies. You cannot exist if you're not growing in some sense. So all of these things will become their problems will become later on, as I explained to you. However, there has been pushback on these overwhelming growth of the markets and market-oriented beliefs. So, especially in the 19th century and the 20th century, there was some pushback by the workers. They were becoming increasingly exploited in the markets, and even suffering a lot because of that. So we had here the 8-hour work week, where you had 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, and 8 hours for doing whatever you wanted. And they also were able to repel child labor laws. They were able to gain workers' rights. They were able to gain welfare. There was also antitrust laws. There were effective pushbacks in creating more humane conditions. And overall, this allowed for the priorities of the market and the priorities of the people operating in it becoming a bit more balanced with each other. And that was ultimately a very good thing. And we are largely still riding the benefits of that very hard work that was done by the people that pushed for these rights in the 19th century and the 20th century. However, around, let's say, 70s, 80s, there started to become a shift that started to slowly chip away at these hard-earned rights. And this is something that became known as market fundamentalism, or even better termed neoliberalism. And this rise of neoliberalism and the increased worship of markets has meant the scale back of many workers' rights and environmental protections in favor of more cutthroat competition and quote-unquote freedom, or at least economic freedom. And one of the ways that we see the impacts of this neoliberalism has been in government budget cutting, deregulation, privatization, especially linked with IMF relief. So if a country has economic problems and they turn to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, for help, they will require them to do some of these things, like privatize the publicly owned companies and deregulate their markets, and in some cases take away workers' rights so that they can recover, at least in economic terms, but maybe not in human terms. And also, as a result of neoliberalism, there has been, I think, some sort of blindness towards something called an externality. So a key concept to understand about markets is that they strive for maximizing private gains and socializing losses. And externalities, and specifically negative externalities, they ensure that the price the consumers experience is not the real price reflecting the true cost of a product or service. And this distorts the market into continuing with negative behavior unless if there is adequate citizen pressure resulting in regulatory oversight. So, for example, the cost of air pollution to society is not paid by either the producers or the users of motorized transport to the rest of society. To be able to do that, you need that public air arena to intervene in the market and to be able to account for this problem, because otherwise the markets, it's good for them that this cost is not borne by them, that it's externalized to someone else. But while it's good for the market, it's not good for the people, and ultimately the people is what makes the market in the first place. So it's sort of a long-term problem that's going to come up eventually. And yeah, the markets, they tend to get stuck in this short-term, quarterly profit thinking, which kind of makes them evolve better to compete with each other, but does not account for long-term issues that we face collectively as humans. So yeah, that was part of the market. You can already see how some of our beliefs have influenced what has happened in history, specifically with neoliberalism and sometimes obsession with a certain path of how things should be, and clinging to one metric like growth or economic freedom. And now we will move on to the next topic. So, the next big topic is fossils, and here I think you can guess what I'm talking about. Of course, I'm talking about fossil fuels, the main convenient energy source that we have been using, and we are using today to fuel everything that we know about. So when I mention fossil fuels here, I'm mostly referring to the three main ones, which are coal, crude oil, and natural gas. And one key thing I want you to to realize is how these fossil fuels, they're actually ancient sun. So the energy from the sun traveled to the earth millions and millions of years ago, and that energy was captured by the biomass of the time. And then as that biomass died and it was compressed and heated with the erosion that happened over time, that created the energy dense fossil fuels that we have extracted and used. So here you can see how we have how coal has originated and how we are using it. And a key thing also to keep in mind is right now our Earth is receiving still energy from the sun, but at the same time we are releasing past energy from the sun into our environment. And that will, of course, have consequences, which I will talk a bit later. But yeah, either directly or indirectly, all fossil fuels came from solar energy. So that's one of the key concepts that you should remember here from this formation of oil and gas and coal. And of course, we have become utterly addicted on these. Our whole of society is dependent on the consumption of this finite resource, as well as a growth paradigm, as we've seen before, which means we need ever increasing amounts of a principally limited energy, which must be consumed to sustain such paradigm. So, even though we might hear a lot about renewables and stopping fossil fuels nowadays, the fact is we have been talking about this for decades, and we have not stopped their consumption. In fact, it has increased. And we have also become dependent on them to sustain our own human populations. So through a process called the Haber-Bosch process, which uses fossil fuels to power nitrogen extraction from the air and making that into fertilizer, we have been able to grow more plants that can feed more people and thus increase our population size. So half of you watching this video would not have existed without fossil fuels, because without fossil fuels, we would not have been able to support the 50% population increase that you can see here in the graph. However, the contribution of fossil fuels to population growth is even more than that. It would not just be that if we had no fossil fuels, we would just lose 50% of the population. We are now around 8 billion people, so we would not just drop to 4 billion. Because our use of fossil fuels is so pervasive and addictive in our lives, we would actually fall closer to 1 billion, according to some estimates. And as I've alluded to, fossil fuels have a lot of externalities and a lot of consequences from their use. These include air pollution, contamination of water, biodiversity loss, and habitat destruction, and the greenhouse effect. Sometimes these externalities are directly from the consumption of the fossil fuels or indirectly from the productions made from their consumption, for example, plastic, or indirectly from the attempt at replacing their consumption with alternatives. For example, instead of using fossil fuels, we might want to create renewables, but we still need to extract things from the earth to do that. So that also has an impact and an externality. And as I've also alluded to, fossil fuels have a limited supply. And I should mention that this estimate on the left, I have linked in the description a document that I wrote with a friend, where we looked at the literature from the International Energy Agency and other very relevant energy reports, and we have come up with a much sooner, or rather, we have estimated that we will experience problems with energy much sooner than expected, within the next 10 years for sure. So this is the state where we are now, and in the chart on the bottom right, that's a more recent report that could hint that we might already be past peak oil, as it has happened in 2020. It might still be early to make this claim. As I mentioned before, we are always dealing with recent information, and if we wait for ultimate high quality information, then it will be too late. But the early indication seems to be that we might have experienced what's called as peak oil. And I should also mention that even if we had all these hypothetical years of fossil fuel reserves left, as it's shown in this graph in the left, um, using those reserves would create apocalyptical externalities that are incompatible with life on this planet. And that is not an overstatement. So, on the one hand, we are dependent on this very cheap energy source. And on the other hand, if we use that, we are ultimately killing ourselves either slowly or rapidly. That depends. So, it's kind of an impossible choice that we have. But I will talk about that a bit later on. Here, I should also introduce the concept of energy return on energy invested. In the beginning of our extraction of fossil fuels, we would just have to spend a little bit of energy to be able to extract a lot of energy. For example, for 1 barrel of oil equivalent that we would spend digging the earth, we would get 100 of barrels of oils out. But as we consume that initial easy oil, as we extracted that easy fossil fuel, it became harder and more expensive in terms of energy to reach the rest of the fossil fuels. And so that energy return on energy investment started declining. So from 100 to 1, which was the initial, more or less, that we were able to get, we started dropping to 80 and then to 50 and down, all the way down currently to 12. So right now, more or less, it would take, for every 1 unit of energy that we spend to extract fossil fuels, we only get 12 units of energy out. And there is a threshold by which our current civilization, with its consumption and with its level of population and agricultural production, there is a threshold by which if we go below having a type of energy that has a very low energy return on energy investment, that means we will not be able to support that civilization. And one key concept that is important to know about also fossil fuels is how we are ultimately blind to them. So here you have a comic that describes one of the thinking processes of a famous scientist called Buckminster Fuller, where he went through the calculations about how actually a car's fuel tank contains the equivalent of 1 man working for 48 months or 48 men working for a single month. And ultimately, all of this energy that we're using is abstracted from our everyday life. Even if we might know intellectually that the objects around us and the food around us and our lifestyle consumes energy, we don't feel it. It feels like it's not really true in an empirical sense of view. We know it scientifically, it's true, but we don't feel it. And I think it's important in many ways, not just in this specific topic, but in the others, that we come from moving from an intellectual or superficial understanding to a more deep wisdom, really knowing and feeling something. And yeah, all our everyday life is abstracted from this energy use, and we don't really truly realize the magnitude of our dependence. So here you have an example of a globetrotter, and that person is not thinking about all the thousands and thousands of quote-unquote slaves. These are the concept of energy slaves that is introduced in this comic, which you can read in the description. And these energy slaves, they fed, they clothed, they heated, they cooled, and transported this traveler every step of the way. So how it looks to be is that our use of fossil fuels will become a blip in the future. And we don't seem to have a good alternative on what happens afterwards. Before, we relied on our own power, our own muscle power, and we would also use forests and firewood, but that never yielded that much energy. And then we discovered the fossil fuels, and our use of energy completely skyrocketed. But because of their finite nature, and because we don't really have good alternatives to them, this is how we would look on a geological timescale. Our use of energy spiked briefly, and then we went back to a baseline that is really hard to conceptualize, because right now we are used to this. We are living in the top of the blip. So to go back to that bottom one is extremely difficult to accept even. And I've mentioned how we don't have really real alternatives, and I feel like I need to substantiate that claim. So basically, right now the current plan is to use a mix of renewables and nuclear to kind of transition away from fossil fuels. However, renewables have negative environmental impacts, less than fossil fuels, but they still have very heavy environmental impacts, and there aren't enough minerals and heavy metals to transition all of the world for our current energy appetite slash use. So here in these papers, they mention how a fast transition, achieving a 100% renewable electric system globally by 2060, consistent with the green growth narrative, could decrease the energy return on energy invested of the energy system from our current 12 to 1 to 3 to 1 by mid-century, stabilizing thereafter at 5 to 1. And here they are talking how we are currently at 12 to 1, but if we switch to renewables, we will be around 3 to 1 or 5 to 1. And the key concept here, or the key takeaway message, is that these energy return on energy invested levels are well below the thresholds identified in the literature required to sustain industrial complex societies. So there simply is not enough materials to do this transition, and there is, even if we do it, we will not have enough energy available to use in our society to maintain the current level of complexity and industriousness that we currently have. So when calculating energy return on energy invested values to sustain an entire civilization, these authors have found that only large hydroelectricity would currently have a high energy return on energy investment of 6.5 to 1, while solar and wind would be below 3 to 1. And we already dammed most of the rivers in the world, so there's not a lot of room to growth there. But this is also, you can see a bit more the energy return on energy investment concept visualized with this net energy cliff, where you can see how initially with historic oil and gas fields, they had a very high, you could get a lot of energy from very small investment of energy. And as we depleted that, we moved to the contemporary global oil and gas. But our alternatives that we are considering are much lower in that yield that we can get. So that puts us in a very complicated position, because we don't have we don't have a good alternative to it. And as I've alluded to, renewable energy has a lot of environmental impacts, specifically with the mining and how it threatens biodiversity. So these paper, they mention how mining threats to biodiversity will increase as more mines target materials for renewable energy production, and without strategic planning, these new threats to biodiversity may surpass those averted by climate change mitigation. And regarding nuclear, on top of it being also a finite resource, and having other issues, but I don't want to get into the topic into that topic in this video. This paper found that nuclear power's contribution to climate change mitigation is and will be very limited. Currently, nuclear power avoids 2 to 3% of total global greenhouse emissions per year. According to current planning, this value will decrease even further until 2040. A substantial expansion of nuclear power will not be possible, and here they mean also not possible both technically and in terms of timescale that needs to be done to address climate change. And given its low contribution, a complete phase-out of nuclear energy is feasible. So to summarize, whether renewable or nuclear, we simply don't have enough materials or time to transition and keep our current energy use level. It is not enough to simply change our source of energy. We have to reduce our energy consumption. However, we are used to a certain lifestyle, so I foresee that it will be very hard to do these changes willingly. They will have to come the hard way. And if you are interested in even reading more about than what I already linked to in the description, you can also check out these books, which I will also link. These describe quite well our our history with energy and how has that evolved and why it has evolved a certain way, and kind of the problems that we have with energy and how that will come to affect us very, very soon. So, now we move into another topic. This is the network. And here I'm referencing the network as basically the impacts of mobile social media and the internet in general, but specifically mobile social media. The initial promises that we had from the internet and social media were of connection and wisdom. However, these quickly gave rise instead to predatory mega corporations and their intent of weaponizing our attention span. So what do I mean by that exactly? Initially, I came across this problem through the work done by Tristan Harris here in the Senate hearing, as well as the documentary he helped made called The Social Dilemma. And the problem that is described really is how, I mean, there is not a structured way to mention all of these, but it involves things like there is a race for our attention. There has been an increase in mass narcissism because of the use of these technologies. These corporations that host these technologies also have acquired more data about us, which can predict our future user behavior, and that might be behavior that we are not even aware of. They can predict things about us that we don't know yet, and they use this data to feed supercomputers and artificial intelligences, and then they aim those at us, and they kind of work us and try to figure out what really makes us work and how to keep us addicted to these technologies more and more. And ultimately, there is a sort of asymmetric power going on, right? They know more things about us than we do. They have more power in a sense about some things than we do. And when usually when you have scenarios of asymmetric power, you need to have responsibilities and regulations in place, which they are not in place. And that's what he describes in this Senate hearing, which I also linked. And yeah, one of the things that also gets people more into these technologies, and the irony is not lost on me that I'm using one of these technologies to spread the topic. But yeah, one of these one of the things that gets more engagement, so sharing it or liking it, tends to be outrage. And this outrage and this engagement is monetized with advertisement. So overall, what tends to happen is that our attention span is reduced, nuance is lost, and binary black and white ideas flourish. So for example, you are watching this video right now with as I'm making it. As you can see, my format is very much like a conference presentation almost, whereas the types of videos that I consume tend to be more catchy, with loud noises, unpredictable cuts. So it's possible that many of the people that started watching this video, because of the format I've chosen, which is important to understand the nuance and complexity of this very difficult topic, they already probably left because this video is boring and it's not triggering their primal attention triggers, let's say, to keep engaged. So yeah, that's kind of a funny, in a sad, tragic way remark. So individually, what impacts? I've already described some of these. Here you can see some of the news clips that also reference some research about this. Yeah, our attention span has massively been reduced, and also our productivity has been affected by this. We can easily become addicted to just scrolling through lots of funny videos or cute videos or cute images and memes and things like that. So that's more of a, even though these are very bad things, this is more on the benign end of the spectrum of individual impacts. In terms of more on the dark side of individual impacts, we have very reliably observed that has been a mental health crisis that has been increasing, with suicide rate spikes, narcissism increases, individual relationships have also been worth less and less with time. But more tragically has been the increase in suicide rates in teen and preteen boys and girls in the newer generations that have grown already in this environment. And these networks and this network and these social media technologies have also resulted in political impacts. These include the Brexit campaign and the election of Donald Trump. And the mechanism by which that happened is described here in this Facebook Cambridge Analytica data scandal Wikipedia page. So you can see how companies and political groups were able to exploit certain key features of these technologies and the data that they collect to maximize the user engagement to the point where they could reliably shift someone's opinions towards a certain side of the political discourse. And one of the very first articles I saw also about the societal impacts of these technologies was this Slate Star Codex opinion article about the toxoplasma of rage. And here he was basically describing how the mechanism of outrage works in society, but more specifically how it seems to be spreading more easily in the social media that we use because of how engaging and how viral it is. It has, because it's so outrageous, people feel the need to share it with others, and eventually companies would take note of that and even reward more of that behavior, because it also drives time that the user spends in their platform, which they can use to serve ads, which is their main source of income. And yeah, overall, the impacts at the society level have been, of course, fake news, misinformation, the rise of conspiracy theories, and the polarization of society. It's becoming hard to reach compromises and agreements about the basic nature of reality, whether or not the pandemic is happening, whether or not the earth is flat. These are just some of the examples of things that are happening. So here I'm linking to a few of these papers that I've found about this topic, and how, yeah, fake news have been becoming a bigger and bigger issue, and we have still not properly regulated these things. We are just being we're just becoming aware that they are a problem, and then we have all that institutional inertia to be able to translate that into some sort of regulatory action. But until that happens, there is a lot of damage that's being happening. So this is another key aspect to understand all of the social media and its impact in our society, and how that plays into a predicament that I will talk about. So now we move to another very big topic, and you might already recognize what this image means. You might know this anomaly by another name. Here, by anomaly, I mean, of course, the temperature anomaly, which is characteristic of global warming and is one of the aspects of climate change that we are observing. So most of us already know this. There has been an observed increase in the global average temperature since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, because of the release of greenhouse gases through our use of fossil fuels. These have a greenhouse effect in the atmosphere, which traps energy from the sun and heats our planet slowly but surely. And I was, of course, aware of this. I was taught this in school, and I was, while I may have had my reservations, I have to admit, when I was younger and a teenager and very rebellious, I ultimately came to see the science and actually accepted what it is, which is a very big problem. However, it was only more recently, I should say, that the magnitude of the problem really became apparent to me when I was introduced to the paper Deep Adaptation and the book The Uninhabitable Earth, and they really highlighted just how horrible things look in the future regarding this problem. And I moved from just intellectually becoming aware of the problem to really feeling, I don't really have a good way to describe it, but really understanding at a deep level and feeling and really being able to see the consequences and almost being there and imagining how bad they will be. I was able to reach that through these works. And yeah, one of the big problems in play with this anomaly is that we seem unable to change our behavior. As I mentioned before, we have all the biases that we discussed already. We have also market pressures and influences. We have denial from the polarization done by the social media. And also just the complexity of the issue is so big and so wide-ranging that it's not enough for just one government to change. All of them must to change. But if one does the requirement changes to stop the burning of fossil fuels, they lose economic competitiveness and they become overtaken by other countries. So there is kind of this game of chicken a little bit being played where nobody wants to commit too much because they might become at a severe disadvantage. They might lose election cycles because many of the measures needed to curb and stop this global warming are simply unpopular with people, even though they must be done. So you have these institutional lock-ins, technological lock-ins. This means that we have already we use cheap energy to build infrastructure that relies on cheap energy. And we don't really have a good alternative, as we've seen, so we've kind of locked in our infrastructure, and it would take a lot of energy to change it. And we don't really have good solutions to this. And also behavior locked in. We are used to a energy abundant lifestyle, as I mentioned with the energy blindness. Just look around right now. You are hearing me or watching me through a screen that required massive amounts of energy, transportation around the globe. The energy you're using comes from different non-renewable sources. All the things around you came and were made possible by fossil fuels. And to be able to go back to a society where we don't use that, we need a good alternative, but we simply don't have it. And so, as you can see here, as the decades progressed, as we became more aware of the problem, we had conferences and reports and protocols that we tried to deal with, but that did not prevent the concentration of specifically CO2 in the atmosphere to increase from 320 to 400 and now to 420 where we are, and as a result the temperature anomaly became more and more dire. So that is the tragedy, you could say, of what we are facing. Simply put, it doesn't seem that we can resolve this collectively through what have we been doing so far, because of different reasons. And surprisingly, we've also been experiencing this anomaly faster than expected. So here you see two examples of newscasts that were using previous forecasts of the effects of climate change in the past. For example, in the left, in 2014, they had predicted that by the year 2050, France would be having this sort of temperature anomaly, when in fact that came in mid-June 2022. And similarly, in 2020, this Met Office was predicting how the UK could look like in 2050 in terms of temperature anomaly, and that kind of happened already this year, 2022. So we are seeing the effects of global warming happen faster than expected, and that is concerning because that means something went wrong with the predictions in a sense. Something was downplayed about the effects. So this of course made me curious. Why didn't we were able to do this? Specifically, the IPCC, the International Governmental Panel on Climate Change. Why does it seem that they were playing down a little bit what could happen? And here I think I found one of the key explanations why the IPCC tends to be conservative. So here they say, why is there a focus on lower end warming and simple risk analysis? Of course, you have the political aspect. It's easier to sell. You need to compromise to the different governments to be able to sell them a solution if it doesn't look like things are that bad. But also, there is a culture of climate science to err on the side of least drama and to not be alarmist. So also complex risk assessments, while they are more realistic, they're also more difficult to do. And this caution is understandable, but is mismatched to the risks and potential damages posed by climate change. So this here is the concept of fat tails. We know that this temperature rise has a low probability, high impact, extreme outcomes, and that climate damages are likely to be non-linear and result in an even larger tail, so to speak. So it is important, they argue, to err on the side of caution, to take more drastic measures rather than to pedal for something more conservative that ultimately we might be shooting ourselves in the foot. But the really key point for me to understand was this concept of delay. So this really for me explains why there was this faster than expected phenomena that we are observing. And I link in this video description also a subreddit which compiles all the different news articles that mention different types of environmental degradation and also global warming aspects that seem to be happening faster than expected. As you already know from this video, we know why some things are happening faster than expected is because we have an optimism bias and we have other biases preventing us from seeing the situation as it truly is. But a key aspect here, this delay, is that there is a 30-year lag between our emissions being released into the environment and those emissions translating into the temperature increase, initially of 50%. So here you see the 30 years. It takes about 30 years to have a 50% effect, and then that continues for hundreds of years more to reach the 100% of its increase. So it takes time between we emit for us to feel first half of that effect and then the rest of that effect. And between the Industrial Revolution, roughly 1750, and 1990, so that's a period of 240 years, we emitted 800 billion tons of CO2, arguably the main greenhouse gas. And since the period I've been alive, we have emitted just that same amount in just a span of 30 years. So this should scare you, honestly, because the effects that we are observing today, which I remind you are half of that because of that emissions that we've done until 1990, because there's this 30-year lag. So right now, 2022, we are experiencing the beginning of our emissions up until 1990, and that already is resulting in a 1 degree global average warming, and that will pale in comparison with what is already baked in, because we already emitted those emissions from 1990 until now, and those will slowly create forcing. We are on track to go well beyond 2 and 3 degrees of warming, in my opinion. However, it's difficult to prove this effectively, although one can try to do some simple arithmetic to try to account for this. Ultimately, it's not really possible until we get very high quality data to prove that we are on track to reach this level of warming, which would be catastrophic for all life on Earth. But I believe we should err on the side of caution and assume that we are already on that disastrous path, so we can try and make the necessary efforts now to reduce as much as possible, to really avoid that catastrophic future that is getting closer. And of course, this temperature anomaly, global warming, is not just about the temperature, it's also about the wider climate change issue. It's only a small problem about it. I also made a video where I mapped out some of the second order consequences of the rise of global average temperature and how that affects the climate in all these intricate ways. Just to mention a brief few, we have aerosol masking, for example, which is if we stop using fossil fuels right now, these fossil fuels, as they're emitted, they also emit some particles, and they reflect actually energy from the sun. But if we stopped suddenly to emit those fossil fuels, we would experience a very sudden warming because that previously emitted particulate that is reflecting the energy from the sun and having a cooling effect would suddenly not be happening, and we would be experiencing that full radiation from the sun. Another consequence is, of course, that with the warming, you eventually have an ice-free Arctic, which further increases warming, as suddenly that energy from the sun is no longer reflected by the bright white ice, and instead hits the darker ocean, which will heat the ocean much faster. Also, a second order consequence of this temperature anomaly will be that more pandemics are unleashed as there is migration of animals and species, and as um, the temperature average of a certain region might change, which might allow for that migration of disease-borne animals and insects. And one more example would be how, as the ocean is also gets warmer, there is an acidification of the ocean happening, and that is risking to kill half of all marine life in our lifetime. So that should be really bringing some alarm bells to you. Another second order consequence that I would like to bring up, for example, is mass migrations. It is forecasted that there will be hundreds of millions, if not billions of people that will have to migrate. And because of not only the temperature anomaly making some places unlivable, but because of the ripple effects such as heat waves and wildfires, or economic damage, or rise of sea levels, things of that nature, they will or just not being able to grow food on that area because of these things, people will migrate, and this will cripple societies because already societies struggle. For example, Europe struggles with migration from wars in the Middle East and things like that. How will be able, which are only a few million people, how will they be able to cope with the mass migration of hundreds of millions of people? It seems something that is a recipe for disaster in all senses of the word. And yeah, I should also mention that there is, of course, a psychological impact of climate change, sometimes also known as eco-anxiety or ecological grief. And remember, this is happening at the same time that we are experiencing the other adverse psychological impacts from the use of the social media, for example. So all of these things are kind of coming together and making all the problems even worse. So here we then get to the topic of the hothouse Earth. So we right now we have shifted the way that the planet would normally operate to this kind of point through our emissions, and we had been facing two roads. One would be where we curb our emissions and we steward the system to a more stabilized section, or one where we let the biosphere continue to degrade, we continue our emissions until we reach certain thresholds, and those kick in some feedbacks. These feedbacks I have mentioned here in these consequences, but you can also read in the literature. And these feedbacks basically create a hothouse Earth where it becomes progressively warmer and warmer, and we are no longer able to control that, even if we curb human emissions and even if we begin some sort of carbon capture program. So because of these feedback loops, if our consumption of energy and resources does not immediately halt, and I would argue it's already too late for that, even though we should still make the effort for future generations to curb our emissions and our extraction of resources as much as possible. Even though it might be too late, we are risking unleashing a hothouse Earth, which makes not only civilization impossible and life on the planet for the reduced population extremely dire, but we approach the verge of extinction, which are already happening for many species, but also for our own. So that is the sobering, humbling point I want to end this topic with, which is that global warming is not something that is discussed because it's fashionable, because it's cool to be green or things like that. There's a reason why there are organizations that talk about human extinction, like the Extinction Rebellion. This is what we're facing. These are the facts. This is the science. This is what the science is telling us. All right. So now we move to the next topic, and I think you can guess by the picture what I will be talking about. Although I will here, I mean, with the concept of particle, I'm of course talking about pandemics in general, but I'm focusing more on the current one, and it has been difficult, to say the least, to live the last 2.5 years, and specifically the last half year, because a lot of things have been happening. And what we do know right now is that the disease that we are facing, this virus, it causes vascular, neurological, autoimmune, and respiratory disease. So it's not just a respiratory disease. Even if you catch it and you just have respiratory symptoms, that's not the only thing it causes. So that's one of the first things that I should mention. And I've made a video on this channel before warning about the pandemic, so you can also check that one out. But first, I want to kind of go a little bit into how we have reached our current situation, how we used to have public health that was actively preventing us from getting a pandemic, and how that was defanged in a sense. We stripped it away through some of the market mechanisms that I've already alluded to in the previous topic. But basically here, this very interesting paper mentions how in the beginning of the original SARS outbreak in 2003, we were able to mitigate the spread of that epidemic, and we were a bit too successful in a sense. So the powers of the World Health Organization were afterwards limited due to economic impacts, they claimed, the other governments, and that reduced their power to, of course, prevent the pandemic and to enact, for example, border controls, and that would have prevented the current pandemic from having spread so much. And also, during certain administrations, not just in the US but in other countries, there were, and also because of the whole market fundamentalism I've talked about, there have been massive cuts to all aspects of science, but specifically cutting the Center for Disease Control, and that, of course, then limited what that center could do in terms of prevention of the pandemic. And yeah, I still stand by my statement, but this that you're seeing right now is the proper way to approach a pandemic. You have personal responsibilities, and you have shared and personal responsibilities. This is the realm of governments and international communities. So you can't just do one thing. You have to do all of them to really to have the most effect. And some things are happening that are, of course, eroding these things, and this could be, for example, the misinformation mouse. But considering all that this is the state of the art that we could have done, the fact is we have completely ignored most of the steps here due to economic and political reasons, and instead we've clinged to incomplete techno solutions. We've relied almost exclusively on non-fully sterilizing vaccines. So that means a vaccine that does not eliminate the virus 100%. And as a result, things have happened because of that. So now I'll be describing what really has happened because of this pandemic, so-called the damage report. So we know we have confirmed deaths by this virus, but our actual best estimates point to the real number of people affected by this being much, much higher. And this is what's called excess deaths. So we are looking at between 16 and 25 million people that have died so far from this pandemic. And that is a huge number. You may have personally been affected by this. You may have lost people you cared about or people you knew. But this is what's this is one of the initial massive impacts of the virus that's not immediately apparent because it the way the virus operates in our bodies makes it so we die from what appears to be other causes when in fact it was the virus. And another impact that this virus has caused is, of course, shortages. These shortages here is the link to the Wikipedia page that lists all of the supply chain issues that have happened. Here you can also have read an article about the 5 ways that the pandemic has changed the supply chain, and you, I'm sure, have been experiencing this in some way or another, directly or indirectly, with longer transportation times or just not being able to buy things that you want online. But perhaps the more dangerous damage that has been done by this pandemic has been what's called as long COVID or post-COVID. And this is a syndrome that usually happens after you have been infected. And even though we have been largely vaccinated ourselves in the West and in the developed world, this does not significantly reduce that risk of long COVID. And this long COVID can be a permanent illness that might disable you for life, or it might last you a few months or even a few years. So it is an extremely challenging condition, and we don't have a cure for it, and we don't have a good way to treat it. So as the pandemic has been allowed to spread because of all the economic, political, misinformation issues that have been plaguing us recently, the chronic effects of COVID have been spreading. And here I have a few articles about that. And we are increasingly aware of how multiple COVID infections harm your body and reduce your life expectancy and can trigger heart attacks and brain strokes and other illnesses like autoimmune diseases and reduced cognitive aspects. So here I also compiled some more articles that I'm also linking. And the data that we are seeing right now seems to indicate that from all the people that get COVID, 12.7% develop this long COVID, and out of those, then a smaller percentage will develop lifelong disabling a condition that they will not be able to work. So that means that a lot of the shortages in manpower that we've been experiencing is due to the pandemic, in fact. So you can see here how millions of Americans have not been able to work. The number of people dropping out of the labor force due to illness has risen markedly during the pandemic in the US and UK. You can see here the impact of long COVID on the UK workforce and how economically inactive Britons with long COVID have doubled in a year. I would argue that there is still not good enough data to claim this, but based on what we know the virus does, based on what we have observed its impacts on the body are, I think most people cannot come out unscathed from COVID after between 5 and 15 infections. That would be my best guess on the true worst impact of the virus. So after 5 or 15 infections, somewhere in that range, you will either become too sick to fully live your life as you used to live it, or you will simply die from that condition specifically, or from related problems like heart attacks and cancers and things like that. To my best guess, but again, take it with a big grain of salt because we simply don't have enough data and good quality data on this specific thing, and by the time we do, it will be too late. Additionally, I would like to mention that because this pandemic has an immune dampening effect, that means it dampens how good your immune system is at fighting other illnesses, we become more vulnerable to other diseases and more pandemics. And there might be early signs that we are struggling already with a second or third pandemic. Again, might be too soon to tell for those specifically, but simply put, it might be that we are more vulnerable to normal diseases like flu or the cold virus. So that's something to keep an eye on. And also there are psychological effects from this pandemic that are Again, I should remind you, on top of the psychological effects of the climate change, and on top of the psychological effects of social media, and of course the normal psychological effects of being in certain market environments where there's a lot of competition and you are not able to provide for yourself or you are exploited. And so we have reached the last big topic of this video, which is overall how all the previous things and a few more combine together to form our predicament, this situation we have found ourselves in, which has no real solution, and we just have to understand it and try to to really learn from it. So one of the first important things to know about, of course, is the concept of overshoot. How we as a species and our use and extraction of non-renewable resources, we have been consuming every year more and more than what the Earth really has. So we've been using storages or stored resources in a non-sustainable way, or better said, in a way that we cannot keep doing forever. And here you see an image of how each country, of course, this is a very unequal scenario. Some countries like Qatar or Luxembourg, they have an intense use of non-renewable resources and in the environment. United States, Canada, UAE, whereas places like Jamaica or Ecuador are considerably more sustainable in that regard. So it is important to note that this predicament, it affects everyone, but certain countries bear considerably more responsibility than others, and that is important always to keep in mind. Also, I've mentioned this with the hothouse Earth image from before, but as we've developed our science, we have been able to identify things called planetary boundaries. These are certain topics of our life on Earth that are indispensable, and if we cross these boundaries through our uncontrolled use of resources or pollution, then we are in very deep problems because we will not be able to sustain civilization or life in our lifetime. So here you can see also the evolution of this science and how that has progressed. There is a documentary on Netflix about it as well that I can link in the description. However, we tend to become quite focused only on one thing at a time, and this has led to some sort of tunnel vision where we only have talked about carbon emissions. And as if you've seen from the previous part of this video, we are not even reducing our carbon emissions, even though it's mostly the only thing we're talking about. But things like air pollutants and ecotoxicity and biodiversity loss, water crisis, just to name a few, these are things that continue to become worse and worse, and we are not giving them the attention that they require. So eventually we might come into a scenario like in this comic is describing, where we have waves and waves of increasingly worse problems heading our way. First with a pandemic, and then with the economic recession, and then with climate change, and then with biodiversity collapse. All of these things, of course, form part of the predicament where we are in. And the key concept, as I mentioned, is overshoot. And the first time that I really was properly modeled in terms of what to expect in the future from it was in the seminal work Limits to Growth. And this was a computer model that was made in the 70s where they plotted what you can see here: resources, births, deaths, food, and different scenarios where we would all come together and do measures to reduce this, such as reducing or increasing birth control, reducing use of materials, transitioning to other different ways of energy. And this image, of course, is much recent. This is where they were comparing how the early projections were faring with the actual data lately. And what they found was that in all the scenarios, where they do different things to try to see if it can work out. In all the scenarios, there is a collapse of civilization, with except one scenario where they do all of the things, that all the little combinations of action possible, and they had started that in 1970. So as it stands now, the data that we have that show this progress that most closely resembles the model where we don't do anything at all. So you can see also how, I mean, maybe you cannot see very clearly, but the scale here goes from 1900 to 2100. And I should mention this original model, was not made with a precise timing, in fact. But what caught my eye was how the increased turbulation happens in the period between 2020 and 2050. So that, unfortunately, all seems to indicate, and this is of course just one model and one report, but there are more that I will link in the description. But all of this seems to indicate ultimately that we will witness, at the very least, the collapse of our current global industrial civilization in our lifetime. Now, civilizations it's normal for them to collapse eventually, or to disappear. That's not something that's very new in history, at least. However, this is the first time we've had a global civilization, and in many ways, because of the way we have used resources until now, it might not be possible to recover from that collapse in the same way as other civilizations came after the fall of previous ones. So all of these are concerns, I would say, that that one should have when analyzing this whole predicament. And I've also mapped out here how there's not just one type of collapse, but there's actually several different types of collapses, and they reinforce each other, exacerbate each other. And first, I should clarify also that by collapse, I mean that there is a gradual, so it's not necessarily a sudden, but it's a gradual simplification of the complexity of a society. So it might be a society with less energy available, that can support a lower population only, that has less material benefits, lower lifespan, things that we tend to assume were happening, or things that we know were happening in the past, but we maybe up until now had not realized could happen again, because the myth of progress is never ending. So in this graph that I made, I try to show a little bit how we have different types of collapse. So we have, of course, environmental collapse and energy collapse. So this is related to how we are running out of fossil fuels. This is how we are affecting the environment, and that environment supports us. This is resource collapse. That's how we need resources other than fossil fuels to fuel our current way of life, or at least to find alternatives for our current way of life, and that also is limited. And as we go a bit further down here, we also have information collapse. Here I'm bringing attention to the fact that, for example, as we experience cognitive decline, for example, from COVID, or even a higher CO2 concentration, this will inhibit our ability to communicate about and to solve parts of this whole predicament. And while we also continue having this social media polarization, which will inhibit our cooperation. And these things come together, of course, to form conflict and wars, and that leads to population collapse. And as there are more stresses in society, that might inhibit also the democratic process in some way. So we end up with governance collapse, the rise of more totalitarian regimes, and of course economic collapse. That's a more common one that gets talked about in the media, but still important in how this all links together. So I should actually finish off this section by saying that because of the nature of the issue we are facing, because it is a predicament, there are no solutions to a predicament. There are only mitigations and adaptations. And specifically, I should reiterate, there are no market solutions, because in part this was part of the problem. The market led us to where we are now. So because the market has this narrow quarterly profit incentive, and our problems are inherently long term, both cannot, they are incompatible with each other. That's why this myth of the green growth, or that we can solve our way out of our issues with technology alone, is fantasy. Honestly, it's just fantasy. So now, depending on how mentally resilient you are, or how how skeptically you've been taking in what I've been talking about, you might find yourself in different sections of this Kubler-Ross grief cycle. First one, of course, might be denial, that I don't know what I'm talking about, that you just don't want to accept anything that I'm talking about. Next step would be anger, being frustrated, being anxious, irritated, what I'm saying, that in some sense you believe me, but you're angry. How could we let this happen? How could we have done nothing about it? Or maybe even blaming myself as the messenger. And then you might reach a point, for example, of bargaining. So this is usually, this and depression is the lowest points, where you're trying desperately to cling on to some hope, and to try to integrate all this information that I've just told you, that you previously had not included in your framework of the world, or you had not considered possible. How do you reconcile what you know about the world and your experiences with what I've just told you? And then eventually, hopefully, with time and with guidance, you will begin to accept what I've told you. At the very least, accept that it's possible. I'm not saying I'm 100% sure. Again, I'm not even sure I'm 100% sure, but I consider it a very likely possibility. So I'm making different choices in my life because of that. And I always, of course, keep a small hope that I'm wrong. I don't want to be right about any of this, but I think it makes more sense to look at things realistically, not with those rose-colored glasses that we have in our brain because of the over-optimism. And also, I mean, keep in mind, I've not been completely super doomer in my presentation. I've not been saying that we're all going to die tomorrow, or that everything is completely and utterly hopeless, and that we are about to be extinct by next year, things like that. The next sections that I will talk about hopefully will bring some, again, not solutions, but I will try to talk about adaptations that we can have, or mitigations, things that we can do. So here we have the 4 R's of deep adaptation. So these are questions that you need to ask yourself over and over again as you're going through this grief cycle. For example, in terms of resilience, what do we most value that we want to keep, and how? Relinquishment, what could we let go of so as to not make matters worse? Restoration, what could we bring back to help us in these difficult times? And reconciliation, with what and with whom shall we make peace as we awaken to our common mortality? So now we are moving on to the last big topic of the video, which is adaptation. So I wouldn't end it in this last slide. I wanted to kind of give you a glimpse of how at least I'm thinking about things, and how it's helping me to also integrate that with work I do in my YouTube channel. So I would say here it's about realizing we can't prevent what's going to happen, but that we must gain knowledge and wisdom and acquire experience to have a chance at surviving it, and to look for places for inspiration, to look for narratives that inspire us to do the changes that we need to do. Those important aspects is, of course, that even though renewables might not save us, and electric cars by themselves might not save us, and recycling by ourselves might not save us, and all of these little things that we do, saving water, every little thing we do today is important because it conserves important resources for future generations. So on that matter alone, we should continue those small steps and even continue with new ones. But even though that might not be fully able to change the course we are taking, I strongly believe that we should continue doing those things, as long as we're not deluding ourselves that doing those things are enough, because they're not, as I've just shown you. And I think one of the more recent inspiring narrative that I found is something called solar punk. Solar punk is a new aesthetic narrative, you could say. It incorporates a lot of ecology in its design. It's not just trying to greenwash um, our current society, it's trying to reimagine it at a fundamental level, how we can gather wisdom from former practices of our ancestors that we can use today, how we can also use new technology we have developed like solar panels and wind turbines and combine that, how we can get rid of some things like cars and move towards more walkable cities, how we can increase vegetation and useful urban farming within our cities as well, and combine all of these things into a more bright future of that we can look forward. So we can know, okay, things are going to be bad, but we have some tools so that we can make things bearable and even nice in sometimes. So we cannot become too depressed about the things that will happen. So solar punk, in my view, I don't see it as something that will fix our issues. I see it as something that inspires us to keep doing the little things every day that not only help future generations by us doing that now, but also helps us have a goal and stay focused, and also helps us ultimately adapt and survive this great transition that is happening. And part of that's very important, I think, is as we feel so hopeless because all of these things I've been talking about, they're completely beyond our individual control, this pandemic and social networks. Sure, we can take precautions and avoid using certain things, but the market and climate change and the overall overshoot, it's impossible to live in a society and be completely independent from it, to not have an impact as we live. So I believe that even though we cannot prevent the bad things that will happen, we must gain knowledge and wisdom and acquire experience so that we can have a chance to survive it. So, for example, focusing on learning new skills involving food and water and energy and waste recycling and transportation and medicine, and how you can practice these things and do them in a low energy environment. So not only just because it will help you in practical ways, in mental ways, in cutting some of your own day-to-day costs, it gives you skills that you can teach others, and you can be of help when something more sudden happens and people rely on you for help. And it will make you a more valuable person overall when it comes to creating future communities that can spread and adapt from the ashes of the old society. And in that regard, I would like to bring aspect to one of the examples where this kind of heavy transition had to happen, which is Cuba. Now, I'm not going to defend the politics of Cuba. It has a lot of issues, of course, but I found it very interesting how during the collapse of the Soviet Union, Cuba, of course, had an embargo from most of the developed world, specifically the United States. So it was heavily reliant on the Soviet Union for specifically fossil fuels and fertilizer. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, they were no longer able to send that to Cuba. And Cuba suffered a very heavy energy crisis. And they had to quickly and creatively find ways to make do with that lack of energy that they were utterly dependent on. And one of the things they did was to very aggressively start urban farming to mitigate the difference in food production that they had up until now. And they did that also through some government action, but mostly through individual action and setting up different types of urban farms. For example, here you see example of something called organoponicos, which is a type of urban farming technique developed in Cuba. They had to develop soil regenerative agriculture methods. They had to develop biopesticide methods, and they had to do all of that with extremely limited resources. They also had to figure out unconventional ways of transportation when they could no longer rely on cars and with fossil fuel so much. They would change certain trains and transport trucks to be able to work with the buses, or they will start using more bicycles and non-fossil fuel related transportation modes, as well as just fixing all the cars that they had by making their own tools and just um, fixing that all the time. For example, when I visited Cuba in 2006, that was a few years after their energy shock. That was about 16 years, I think, from their energy crisis. Most of the cars were, of course, old because they did not receive new cars, so they had to make do with the old cars and just fix them all the time. So all of these things are part of our approach to adaptation and mitigation of the shocks that happen when you have that kind of predicament unfolding. But importantly for us, especially in urban areas, is the problem, and it truly is a problem of land and timing, because we are most of us watching are limited. We have limited access to land, and this happened, as I mentioned, from the ransacking of the commons to the enclosure process. We are either renting or buying an apartment, but it's still small. We don't have huge amounts of space to grow things and to support ourselves truly self-sufficiently, especially in densely populated urban areas. So, in a sense, because the land is being used for other things that are non-sustainable, we have to wait for that collapse to happen so that then the land can become part of the commons again, and then we can get together at a local community level and start again this process of urban farming and becoming more self-sufficient, even though we have less energy and less resources. However, if we wait too late with doing this, because this land reclamation that needs to happen is very it takes time to build the soil, to create the food, to even learn the skills, so you make sure you're producing as much food as you can in a sustainable way. So one has to kind of act now, in a sense. But as I've mentioned already, we, especially in Europe and in most of the developed world, we live in quite densely populated areas. To give you an idea, this example of Cuba I just mentioned, they had 100 people per square kilometer, so that put them around here, whereas in Europe we have places 10 times that amount. So it's simply not possible to just suddenly shift gears and grow all the food in the cities suddenly, because the soil needs time, and there needs to be a lot of space allocated for that requires energy that we might not have to change it. So this is where I'm kind of going to try to tie this to the kind of work that I'm doing with my channel, mostly hydroponics. I believe that organic hydroponics can be a buffer to absorb that shock that happens if, for example, we don't have the energy or the materials. If we are in a high density population environment where soil has not yet been created, we can try to use this organic hydroponics to help support that density of the population, to buffer the negative effects until we transition to a time where we have all properly sustainable food production systems going on. And yeah, soil takes time to reach that ideal stage. So because also organic hydroponics is can grow faster, and the soil input, the nutrient inputs can also be developed faster, and more importantly, it does not require soil and can also be grown vertically. All of these, I believe, can help buffer a little bit. Will not be enough for all, but I think it will help buffer a little bit of the effects. And yeah, so that's ultimately how I'm trying to think about a little bit my work, to also to motivate my work, even if I'm wrong about everything that I've said up until now, and the future is just rosy and everything is perfect. On the off chance that that is not the case, that the future has problems, at least I can be happy that I helped develop some of these things. Not that I'm trying to save the world, just that I enjoy doing these things on their own, and if other people can benefit from them, then why not? So in that sense, I hope to continue doing a lot of the work with sustainable hydroponics in my channel. And if you're one of the people that has been following me for a long time because of that content, then I hope you continue to support me with your attention and maybe share the video if you also like it. So it has been a very, very long video. If you have survived this far, I gotta give it to you because I understand that this format is not catchy. It requires patience. It requires attention. I'm probably rambling a little bit sometimes, but I wanted just to finish off by thanking you for your attention. If you're someone that has heard what I had to say and felt uneasy and anxious and sad and depressed, I also encourage you to reach out. I put some two resources here. There is this collapse support subreddit and the related Discord. These have been very helpful for many people to help process the experience, to talk about their fears with other people that have gone through the same, and to kind of validate, maybe not validate it at a scientific sense, more to talk about how it feels. If it's right and I feel anxious about it, what can I do to feel less anxious about it? Or what are the tools I can gain to become more mentally resilient? And then I've also wanted to link to a few more things that I think were super helpful for me to understand all these topics that I've talked about. So starting with There's No Tomorrow, that was really the first documentary I've watched that gave me the sight of the future with low energy and how we're not going to be able to get to fix this just with technology. So that one, I would say, on a scale of no anxiety to anxiety, is a little bit anxiety inducing. For example, How to Enjoy the End of the World and A Future Without Oil, I would put a little bit less anxious inducing, although they will still make you a little bit uneasy. I think the people talking present the topics in a way that kind of gives you a little bit of hope of how we might be able to survive and adapt through this scenario. The Great Simplification is also describing in great detail the problems of collapse overall and our predicament. Then we have the Collapse 101 series that's also very interesting, and Breaking Down Collapse, the podcast, I have found very approachable to introduce to people that are new to the topic and want to be introduced to the topic easily with two hosts that are very relatable. Planet of the Humans by Michael Moore. That has been a bit more anxiety inducing because that's the first time most people have been exposed to the idea that renewables are not enough to take us out of this predicament. And finally, if you want something to really pump you up and give you some hope about what things you can do, what tools do we have to help us adapt and mitigate to this predicament, then the documentary Living the Change, Inspiring Stories for a Sustainable Future, I think is a must-watch. And lastly, if you're still missing some inspiration, I highly recommend searching for solar punk videos and solar punk art and literature and finding solar punk communities nearby, because they will be very inspiring and they will get you out of that maybe negative mental cyclical thought pattern that you might get if you dive too much into negative news or negative science, and get you more into the active and inspired and get ready to do something practical around you and to be the little change that you want to see in the world. So finally, thank you again for your attention, and if you have feedback and comments, please let me know, and look up for my next videos. I will be uploading some videos soon about hydroponics again. But yeah, thank you again so much, and see you in the future.